Welcome back, college football fanatics. Let's talk about the 12-team college football playoff. Literally everyone, not being hyperbolic or exaggerating here, everyone has reservations or concerns about the 12-team college football playoff. Whether it's myself, the majority of college football fans, college football content creators, or even the college football playoff committee, who now almost hypocritically has pined for this playoff model for the past 3 years and have been developing it for probably the past half decade, if not longer. They are now likely going to expand the playoff again in the 2026 through 2027 season to a 14-team college football playoff. So this is a model that has a lot of controversy. It is confusing. It very much is in explaining it. So bear with me when I try and explain the model briefly and also give my predictions on who will win the college football playoff, who will participate in it, how the seeding will work. The seeds that I give are not how I think the college football playoff committee should seed the 12 participating teams, but rather how I predict that the college football playoff committee will seed the 12 teams that I think they will select based off of my record predictions, based off of my predicted strength of schedule, and also based off of how I think they operate due to the past collecting of what their biases have been and what their blind spots have been and what they value in a college football playoff participant. So I'm going to be giving my 2024 through 2025 season college football playoff predictions. That's what we're going to be talking about in this video. This is my biggest video, the video that I've spent the most time editing and have tried to look the cleanest, that I've put the most intentional effort in for the 2024 season so far, which isn't saying much because we're in March, we're in the preseason, and I haven't even done a top 25 video or Big Ten predictions video yet, let alone for the other Power 4 conferences, the ACC, Big 12, and SEC, all of which I'm going to try and give prediction videos for as well. So it would be just such a huge support from all of you college football fanatics if you could hit that like button, comment your own 12-team playoff predictions down below to not only boost engagement and get us into the algorithm, but also so that we can have a conversation, because you probably see some things that I don't, and your insights will be very helpful. And most importantly, hit that big red subscribe button and click the notification bell so that you can get notified when I release more college football content. College Football with Sam is the best Big Ten football content channel on YouTube. We are trying to evolve to being the best college football channel on all of YouTube while still maintaining that Big Ten aspect. And I'm a fan of Michigan, have a huge amount of respect for Ohio State and the rest of the Big Ten programs. So this will always be a place that primarily looks at the Big Ten. But I also want to cover more of college football because it's such a fascinating sport. You really can't get enough of it. You just can't. At least I can't. And I imagine for many of you, it's the same. So it would mean a lot if you can do those things. And also, stick around until the end of the video because there is a surprise at the end that features really hints at some of the teams that I left out who I think could get into the college football playoff if my predictions are wrong. And many of them probably will be. Before we dive any further, please check out my Patreon page as well. I just released a blog, an article, really. It's probably more of an article than a blog, detailing my top 25, giving about a paragraph explanation for each top 25 team, and more of a full paragraph explanation for the top 10 teams. How I feel about the program, who are some key incoming transfers if the schools use the transfer portal a lot, who are some returning starters, returning production values, and even coaching changes. It's all there on my Patreon page. It'll be the pinned article if you subscribe as an All-American or Heisman member, which is only $10 or $25 per month. Also, to celebrate March Madness, which the college football playoff is trending in a March Madness direction, I do have a group, a bracket group open on ESPN that I will be linking in the description and in the pinned comment. So check that out as well, along with my merchandise page. Thank you to Crash2488 for being a Heisman member, to Spencer Bringhurst, Chris Slane, and SFS Inverted for being an All-American member, and to Will Loftus, John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for being all-conference members. I know it's taken a while to get here, but I wanted to give my thoughts and also make sure that you can have even more college football content flooding through your screen throughout the season, as that's very important. We never want to have the college football content well run dry on us. And sometimes, because there are other things that we watch on YouTube besides college football, if you aren't constantly plugged into multiple channels, that can happen. But I also wanted to give my thoughts on the 12-team playoff as well. And briefly, want to give some more on them with this model. This is how the 12-team playoff will operate. The highest ranked, the 4 highest ranked conference champions will get buys. They will get first round buys. Presumably, these will be the Power 4 champions, though there could be an exception where, let's say, Big Ten or SEC have a down year, because let's be honest, those are the best 2 conferences, or the Big 12 and the ACC have what will probably be a normal chaos year, and an upset in the conference championship game happens. Maybe a 13-0 Group of 5 champion who had a tough schedule, or they have a good reputation in terms of rankings, like let's say Boise State or Liberty. I was about to say SMU, but they joined the ACC last minute in the previous season. Unless that happens, then it'll likely be the Power 4 teams that get those buys, and the Group of 5 team will probably be somewhere in that 5 to 12 range, much closer to the 12 seed, even if they're undefeated, than the 5 seed. And seeds 12, 9, 11, and 10 will play at the stadiums, at the home fields of 5, 8, 6, and 7, respectively. The first round of the playoffs will be home playoff games. So let's say that Penn State's the 5 seed. Let's say Boise State's the 12 seed. Boise State will be playing Penn State in Beaver Stadium in December, which is incredible in my opinion. That's one of my favorite things about this expanded playoff is home playoff games. 12 versus 5, the winner of that will play number 4. 9v8, the winner of that will play number 1. 3 will play the winner of 11 and 6. 2 will play the winner of 10 and 7. And the winner of 2 versus 10 or 7 will play the winner of 3 versus 11 or 6. And 1 versus 9 or 8 will play the winner of 4 versus 12 or 5. And the second round, third round, fourth round of the playoffs, those will all be a New Year's Six Bowl or neutral site field. It's only the first round where you have home college football playoff games. Just wanted to make that clear. This can be confusing. My head's actually hurting a little bit right now because there's a lot more to think about for this playoff model than the 4-team playoff model and the New Year's Six Bowl games that were a part of that system as well. So let me introduce you to the first 4 set of teams. These are teams who are going to be playing on the road in the first round of the college football playoff. These are seeds 9 through 12, the lower third of the 12-team college football playoff. At number 12, I have Liberty. Liberty returns Caden Salter. They return their entire coaching staff, including Jamie Chadwell and the architect behind the offense in Isaac Newland, along with some players along the offensive line and running back position. Liberty nearly ran for 300 yards per game last year. I expect them to once again win their conference, go undefeated, and they will represent the Group of 5 in the 12-team playoff as the highest-ranked Group of 5 champion. At number 11, we have Oregon. Oregon brings in Dylan Gabriel and Dante Moore from the transfer portal at quarterback, Jamari Caldwell at defensive tackle, and Evan Stewart at wide receiver. Those are just some key transfers. They brought in some other players. They return running back Jordan James, who had an awesome, I believe, freshman season last year, and they return Johnny Cornelius and Josh Connerly Jr. at tackle. They return Terrence Ferguson at tight end and Jordan Birch at defensive end. And don't forget about Tez Johnson at wide receiver. Oregon will be good. I do think they'll be underrated at their seed. I think Oregon will be once again a top 10 team like last season, but I do have them losing to Ohio State and Michigan. And outside of Ohio State and Michigan on their schedule, there isn't much that would be impressive even if Oregon won all those games like 70-14, for example. A game at Wisconsin, that could be an impressive win outside of potentially beating Michigan or Ohio State. But I have the Ducks losing to the Wolverines and the Buckeyes, and I don't think Wisconsin's going to be a top 10 team next year. So because they don't have any key outstanding win, the Ducks will not be seeded high by the College Football Playoff Committee, despite the fact that I think not just they're a top 10 team, but I do think they're a top 6 team in terms of power rankings. And number 10, we have the Texas Longhorns. Texas, once again, like Oregon, but not to the same degree, I think will be underrated by the College Football Playoff Committee in terms of seeding. I think Texas is a top 8 team in terms of power rankings. Again, if you want to get my personal rankings, like how I would rank the top 25 and even top 35 teams, because I have the next 10 teams out listed as well, just in name only, check out my Patreon page and sign up as an All-American or Heisman member. If you're a Heisman member for 6 months, you do get signed College Football with Sam merch. It's going to be the last time I mention that, though. Texas returns Quinn Ewers. They return much of their offensive line, but they lose A.D. Mitchell, Xavier Worthy, and Jordan Whittington at wide receiver. Also backup Isaiah Nayer transfers to Nebraska, and they lose tight end Jatavion Sanders and running back Jonathan Brooks, who was injured for much of last season. They also lose defensive tackle Byron Murphy and Tavondre Sweat. Yeah, they lose much of their impact high-ceiling players. So I do not think Texas is poised to win the SEC next season. I think much like Oregon, they will run into some issues. They play at Michigan early in the year. They host Georgia later in the year in conference play. They also have, for the first time ever, a showdown against Texas A&M. And by first time ever, I mean first time ever in the SEC and first time in over a decade in general. They also play Oklahoma in a neutral site. I do think the Longhorns, much like Oregon, they're going to suffer 2 losses. They're going to lose to Michigan on the road and Georgia at home. Finally, we have Missouri, who probably outside of Liberty will have the easiest schedule out of all of these teams. And I think Missouri isn't as good as Oregon and Texas, but because of the fact that I think their only loss is going to be suffered on the road at Alabama, they'll have wins at A&M, much like Texas. They'll have a win over Oklahoma, much like Texas. So they'll have those same key wins that Texas does, but with 1 less loss. And even though they have an easier schedule, and that's the reason why they have more wins, the College Football Playoff Committee will value an 11-1 team with an easier schedule, typically over a 10-2 team with a tougher schedule. So that's why I have Missouri seeded 9th. So that's going to be one part, the first half of the first round of the College Football Playoff. These are the away participants in the first round. So seeds number 9 through 12. Seeds number 5 through number 8, 5, 6, 7, 8. These are going to be the home participants in the first round of the College Football Playoff. We have Notre Dame, Penn State, Alabama, and Ohio State. Yes, this means because the highest ranked champions, the 4 highest ranked champions, again, this is a lot to think about, because they get auto buys. And as I've already told you that Liberty is a group of 5 champion, the best group of 5 champion, this means that every team up here, outside of Liberty, and every team in college football, including Liberty, outside of they haven't won a Power 4 conference. They haven't. So Penn State, Ohio State, Alabama, Texas, Oregon, Missouri, they're not winning the Big Ten or the SEC respectively. Notre Dame is an independent ACC affiliate, and Liberty, I believe, is a part of either the, I think Conference USA is who Liberty is a part of. I'm blanking on that, just very briefly. Let's start with Notre Dame. Again, go from the worst in the seeding order to the best. We like to save the best for last on this channel. Notre Dame loses Sam Hartman, they lose Audric Estime, they lose Joe Alt at offensive tackle, but they return their offensive guards and they bring in Riley Leonard from the transfer portal, good quarterback from Duke. I think Notre Dame will be pretty accurately seeded, and I think a large portion of that is the fact that they are an independent, and their independent schedule isn't a cakewalk, but it isn't tough either. It won't be as tough as last year's, in my opinion. They return Pat Coogan and Bill Scroth at offensive guard, and then Mitchell Evans comes back at tight end, had a standout year last season, and they do bring in Mike Denbrock at offensive coordinator. The defense, you return Jack Kaiser at linebacker. They lose a ton outside of that, but they return some defensive linemen as well, players who could be All-American caliber. I think Notre Dame will improve once again under Marcus Freeman, who improved from 9-4 in 2022 to 10-3 last season. I think their only loss will be suffered at the end of the year against USC, which will mean they will have a great win at home against Florida State, who I still expect to be a top 25, in fact, better than a top 25 team this coming year. And number 7, we have the Penn State Nittany Lions. Penn State, James Franklin, he's under pressure. That bowl game against Ole Miss, the Peach Bowl, was not a good performance. It again showcased that he just sucks at game management. I can't say that enough. And the losses to Michigan, where Michigan just, here, Blake Corum, take the ball. Here, Donovan Edwards, take the ball. J.J. McCarthy, we're going to occasionally use you almost in a wide receiver end-around position from snap to pick up first downs. And they won. I mean, it was just not a good performance. Michigan did not play even close to their ceiling against Penn State, and they still won and controlled that game start to finish. And to a lesser extent, Ohio State did the same thing, though more so through Kyle McCord and Marvin Harrison Jr. Penn State has questions. I think they're going to have their best season under Franklin in terms of record, only losing to Ohio State at home. They host Washington. They play at Wisconsin. They play at USC, and they have a early road trip against West Virginia, a team who will test Penn State's defense with that rushing attack. But Penn State, they return Drew Aller, they return running backs Nicholas Singleton, Katron Allen, return tight end Tyler Warren, and all of their wide receiver core outside of Dante Cephas and both of their guards. They return Abdul Carter and Keaton Ellis and Jalen Reed at linebacker and then safeties respectively, and they return their entire defensive tackle core. They also upgraded OC with Andy Kotelnicki. I think Penn State is in for a good season. And at 6, we have Alabama. Kalen DeBoer steps into an intriguing role in year 1. You have all the talent in the world, but so much departing production. Alabama's outside the top 100 in returning production. However, they do return Jalen Milroe at quarterback. They return, I forget who they bring back at running back, but it might be Jace McClellan, or if he left, I don't know. I know Roydo Williams transferred to Florida State. And defensively, they return the interior of their defensive line. And this is a team that's so loaded with talent, even though I don't know a ton about their roster, something that I will learn more as the preseason goes on, and especially in the regular season when we get to watch them play. They have so much talent, and they're bringing in offensive center Parker Brailsford, who was elite at Washington, and a great wide receiver in Jeremy Bernard, who was just in a loaded room last year. That I have faith that this team is going to be great. They're not going to miss much of a beat, especially with Jalen Milroe being coached by Kalen DeBoer and Nick Sheridan. He might be the best quarterback in the country next season with that coaching. And at number 5, we have the Ohio State Buckeyes. Ohio State will be the best team out of any college football team who did not win a Power 4 conference. I have Ohio State going undefeated in the regular season, much like Alabama, which is why I didn't even bother mentioning Alabama's schedule, because I actually have them going 12-0. But what this implies is that Ohio State and Alabama both lose in their conference championship games. This means that for the first time since 2019, Ryan Day will beat Michigan. This also means that, sidetrack a little bit to Kalen DeBoer and Alabama, yes, I am picking them to beat Georgia. So I'm picking Kirby Smart to suffer his second loss in a row in this current losing streak to Alabama. He's had multiple before. I'm picking Georgia to lose to Alabama. I'm also picking Michigan to lose on the road to Ohio State. Home field advantage plays in with both of them. For Ohio State, It's more so the fact that, look, they're going to be an elite team this season. They return much of their defense, including Denzel Burke at corner, including safety Lathan Ransom. They bring in safety Caleb Downs, who's an All-American at Alabama. They return JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer at defensive end, along with Tyleik Williams and others at defensive tackle. 4 out of 5 offensive line starters come back. They return Travion Henderson, bring in Quinjon Judkins, and they return Emeka Egbuka. There's just so much to love about this Ohio State team, and I think that the College Football Playoff Committee will recognize that Ohio State, out of all the non-Power 4 champions or non-top 5 conference champions, they'll notice that Ohio State's the best out of every college football team but those 4 who will receive byes. And those 4 who receive byes are Georgia, Michigan, Florida State, and Utah. I do think that Utah, returning Cameron Rising at quarterback, returning Brant Kuthi, these are injured players. Lander Barton at linebacker is another player who was injured later in the season. And returning all they do at the offensive line, wide receiver, the D-line, and with just Kyle Whittingham now playing in an, let's be honest, easier conference, I'm excited for Utah. Utah is interesting because they're a team that I have been too high on for 3 years in a row. I've predicted them to do better than their end-of-season record in 21, 22, and 23. So I'm curious as to how they will do this season. If I'm once again too high on them, there's a good chance that I am, as I don't think there's any clear number one in the Big 12. I lean toward that being Utah, but Utah is more of a 1A than a straight-up number 1. I have them going 12-1. I have them losing to Colorado on the road, but they're outside of that game, they're going to win every other one, and they're going to beat Oklahoma State in the Big 12 championship game. And number 3, we have Florida State. Florida State loses a ton, but they bring in transfer quarterback DJ Uiagalelei, transfer running back Roydell Williams. They bring in Marvin Jones, defensive end, transfer from Georgia. And there are other players, some of which are probably better and more important than the 3 players that I just mentioned. Florida State's reloading through the transfer portal. They just had their best recruiting class in not over a decade, but their best recruiting class since Jimbo Fisher left, which is really close to a decade. Also wouldn't shock me if Jimbo Fisher doesn't coach for another decade or more than that with how much money he received from A&M. But again, back on topic. I think Florida State will once again win the ACC. I have the Seminoles under head coach Mike Norvell and with much of his staff coming back. I have them beating everyone in the regular season except for Notre Dame on the road. So they'll beat Clemson again. And I have them beating Virginia Tech in the ACC championship game. I think they will be seeded higher than Utah because the ACC is a tougher conference, I think, than the Big 12. I did not hold this opinion originally after the national championship game ended and the 2024 preseason immediately began. I thought the ACC was weaker. In terms of overall play, that might be the case, but in terms of the top teams, which is what the College Football Playoff Committee cares about, the ACC is tougher. Like Florida State, Notre Dame as an affiliate, they play enough ACC teams where they factor in the schedule, and Clemson are probably a better group of 3 than, I would say, Kansas, Kansas State, or maybe you could sub out one of them for Oklahoma State and Utah. There's just more known, more collective talent within the ACC right now, and the College Football Playoff Committee cares about that. Getting onto the Big 10 and SEC champions, I have Michigan at number 2. They will be 4-peating as Big 10 champions. Now, they lose to Ohio State, in my opinion, in the regular season, and they lose a ton. So I could be too high on Michigan. I think that Michigan, much like Florida State and Utah in terms of power rankings, will be overrated given their seed. That's what I don't like about these byes. I understand that you have to incentivize conference championship games in some way, but I think giving home field advantage to the higher half of seeds already does that, especially since with these new schedules and conferences, it will be hard to go undefeated. The only way that you'd be guaranteed to be a a home team in that inaugural round if you don't win your conference championship game is if you enter with a 12-0 record, which is what Ohio State and Alabama did. And that's going to be unlikely for most conference championship game participants anyway. I don't think you need to go so far to incentivize winning your conference championship game by giving a bye week. That will put teams like Michigan, Florida State, and Utah, who I don't think are outside of Michigan, I don't think any of those teams are top 4 teams, and Michigan I don't view as a top 2 team. That will give teams that'll overrate teams. It'll put teams that aren't as good as their seed indicates in those specific positions. But I have Michigan at number 2 because they return running back Donovan Edwards, they return tight end Colston Loveland, and on defense they return starter Mason Graham at defensive tackle, starter Will Johnson at corner, Rod Moore and Makari Page starters at safety, and Kenneth Grant at defensive tackle, and Josiah Stewart and Derek Moore at defensive end. That's an all-American defensive line. That might be the best defensive line in the country. I think that Sharon Moore, with a great staff, with great program depth, I think that Michigan will surprise people. They'll go 11-1. They'll beat Texas. They'll beat Oregon. They'll lose at Ohio State, but I don't think that Ryan Day will beat Michigan 2 times within a single week. So I think that Michigan will get revenge in the Big Ten championship game. And finally, we have Georgia at number 1. The Georgia Bulldogs under Kirby Smart, they were number 1 for all of last season until Nick Saban just waltzed in and put down the banana peel and Kirby Smart, and Mike Bobo slipped on it. And that's why Alabama got into the college football playoff instead of Georgia, despite the fact that power rankings would tell you Georgia was the much better team. But alas, power rankings are just power rankings, and that isn't what should determine seeding. It should be a factor, but it shouldn't be the biggest determining factor. Ultimately, winning your games is more important than analytics and stuff like points per play and other factors. 2021 Nebraska is proof of this, as they were a top 25 team by power rankings for much of the year, and yet they were 3-9. So, yeah, your record, your strength of record, I think should matter more than your strength of analytics, and I think anyone would agree with that. Georgia, I have going 11-1 in the regular season, losing to Alabama on the road, but getting revenge on them in the conference championship game. I think that Georgia, returning quarterback Carson Beck, returning wide receivers Ra Thomas, Dominic Lovett, guard Tate Ratledge, having a loaded offensive line, Todd Hartley at tight ends. Coach, he's bringing back Oscar Delp, who's a mini Brock Bowers, Trevor Etienne transferring in at running back. Georgia will feature one of the best offenses in the country. They also bring back notable secondary players as well. They could have one of the better secondaries in the country. Malachi Starks comes back at strong safety, and Michael Williams returns at defensive end. I do think that Georgia is actually accurately rated at their seeding. I do think that in terms of their resume and how they'll perform in the regular season, I do think that Georgia will be the best team in the country by the time that the college football playoff selection show comes on. So I think they'll be accurately rated here, unlike the other 3 Power 4 champions will get byes, who I think are slightly overrated at their seeding. Let's briefly go through the games, give a brief preview. I know I spent a lot of time talking about why these teams are in. I think that gives enough grounds to why I have each team advancing. I have Ohio State beating Liberty. I think they'll crush Liberty. We don't really need to go over that. Notre Dame, home field. It'll be a weather adjustment for Missouri, even though they're one of the few SEC teams who probably gets snow often. It'll be an adjustment to play on the road at Notre Dame in the winter, and I think that Missouri has questions on defense, and they don't have the same talent pool that Notre Dame has. I think Eli Drinkwitz is a better coach than Marcus Freeman, and I think Missouri will have the better offense, but Notre Dame will be the much more balanced team, and I think that with home field advantage will give Notre Dame an edge. I have Oregon road trip. Dan Lanning, who's 0-3 against Kalen DeBoer. I have Oregon pulling off the upset. Oregon is recruiting at a very high level. I think that they will be able to match pound for pound in terms of depth with the Tide. I think Lanning has a lot of momentum. And even though I don't trust Dylan Gabriel a ton, he's still a great quarterback. I think Jalen Milroe will be better next year just with superior development and a higher ceiling. But outside of quarterback and special teams, Oregon might be better at literally every other position. They return a lot more production, and I think Oregon will be on fire. Plus, Oregon will finish off the year, I think, a little angry with what I think will be close losses to Michigan and Ohio State, knowing they have the potential to win it all, but just falling short due to a variety of reasons. I think specifically defensive trench play. And I don't think Alabama has the same defense that Ohio State and Michigan will. I think that'll give Oregon a variety of outcomes to pull off an upset in Tuscaloosa. So I have them advancing. And Penn State against Texas, I think Penn State's just straight up better. Penn State will be better at the interior of the defensive line. I think they'll be better on the interior of the offensive line. Penn State will have the better run game. There's a chance, even though Quinn Ewers was much better than Drew Aller last year, with Andy Kotelnicki, Drew Aller could make a massive jump. He could have a breakout season. And I'm not a big Quinn Ewers fan. And even though they bring in Silas Bolden at wide receiver, they bring in Isaiah Bond at wide receiver, Amari Niblack at tight end, I don't think that group will be as good as A.D. Mitchell, as Xavier Worthy, and as Jatavion Sanders. I think that Texas will, in fact, regress compared to last year. Penn State will advance. And man, I've talked about before when that weather difference can be just enough to really help the SEC beat down the Big Ten. Talk about the inverse here. Even if Texas was a little better than Penn State, playing them on the road, in the cold, in the mountains, probably will be windy with a loud, dedicated fan base. That'll be tough for Texas to overcome. So I have Penn State advancing past the Texas Longhorns. In the next round of games, I think that Ohio State will beat Utah. We've seen Kyle Whittingham and Ryan Day play each other before in the 2021 through 2022 Rose Bowl. And even though Utah had better fight, even though they had a better game plan and they had more of their starters, Ohio State's talent advantage was just way too much. And there are questions about how Rising will play. Utah didn't have a great offense outside of parts of their run game early in the season without Rising. Ohio State will just have such a higher ceiling. And believe me, with that loss to Michigan and Indy, they will be on fire. I mean, there's no way that they won't be motivated with another chance to put on a good show. I mean, just look at what Ryan Day did to Georgia. He nearly beat him. A great elite Georgia team nearly pieced them apart after losing to Michigan to close out the 2022 regular season. I think that Georgia, this is even more of a no-brainer. They'll crush Notre Dame. Riley Leonard versus Carson Beck, not even close. Beck's much better. The same goes for probably every position except for the defensive line and maybe tight end, because I think Mitchell Evans is awesome. And every other position outside of special teams and tight end and defensive line, Georgia is just the far superior team. And Georgia they'll get to choose, or not, they won't choose, but the College Football Playoff Committee will ensure that Georgia has a type of home field advantage in this former New Year's Six, but now just neutral site bowl area. Georgia will win. Georgia will dominate Notre Dame. I think that Oregon will beat Florida State. Like I mentioned earlier, Oregon, I think, will be underrated. I think the 2 losses and not having many impressive wins will make them underrated in terms of seeding. Florida State will be, I think, drastically overrated in terms of seeding. They'll play a lot like last year's team, except when healthy, they won't have the same ceiling. This could also be a rout. I think Ohio State and Utah score-wise won't be a rout, but it could be. Georgia Notre Dame certainly will. The most competitive game, I think, will be Michigan versus Penn State. Oregon versus Florida State will be more competitive than Georgia Notre Dame. Oregon will be the better team at most positions, and I think they'll, in the fourth quarter, be able to pull away. And it's, Florida State, you get in the playoff, but last year's team, healthy, would have been better, and even then they wouldn't have provided the same competition that Texas, Washington, and Alabama did. Although, I don't know about Texas. I mean, they got pieced apart by Washington. It's a very weird team last year's Longhorns were. But I have Oregon beating out Florida State. Michigan against Penn State. This will be a close game. I actually think Penn State has the higher ceiling than Michigan entering this season, primarily because of the coordinator hire of Andy Kotelnicki and the quarterback position, along with the fact that Penn State might actually have the better running back room. And I expect Tom Allen to be a better defensive coordinator in terms of fundamentals, in terms of tackling, than Manny Diaz was. But Michigan will be a much more consistent team. Michigan will be better in the trenches, especially on the defensive line. And Franklin just can't win big games. He already will have a big win against Sark in my hypothetical scenario. I can't say that again, especially for a Michigan team that will be able to run the ball well and stop the run and rush the passer well. So I have the Michigan Wolverines advancing to the Final Four, where they will play Oregon. And I have Oregon actually winning that game. I think it'll be hard for Michigan to beat Oregon twice. I think Oregon has the higher ceiling than Michigan does. And I think that neutral site indoors, most likely, in warmer weather will favor Oregon more than it does Michigan. And Michigan, with some concerns at depth in the secondary, the wide receiver room, even the offensive line, despite the fact that I think that'll be a strength of this team, and quarterback, Michigan could suffer a heavy attrition even with their bye week through the regular season and the postseason. So I give Oregon the edge there. Also, this isn't Jim Harbaugh coaching Michigan. This is Sharon Moore. And much like Dan Lanning, who's a great coach, but he's also young. And I think Sharon Moore throughout the regular season, and probably even more so in the postseason, wouldn't be shocked to see some of his youth and greenness in terms of, green as in not very experienced yet as a head coach role show, much like Ryan Day did against Clemson, despite the fact that he had the much better team in the 2019 Fiesta Bowl. Speaking of Ohio State, Georgia and Ohio State will match up. And I unfortunately think, I say unfortunately because I'd rather Ohio State win than Georgia, I do think that Georgia will win this game. I think that Georgia has the better offense. Ohio State has the better defense. Ohio State may even have the better special teams unit. But Kirby Smart's a better coach than Ryan Day. He is. And Georgia returns more. They're 48th in returning production. Ohio State's 70th. And in a game in which Georgia's offense is just going to be awesome, Kirby Smart will draw up a good defensive game plan regardless of if his defense is just near elite like it was last year or elite like in the prior two seasons. We have questions about Ohio State managing their offense and even about Jim Knowles managing his defense. I think he's an elite defensive coordinator, and Ohio State, I think, will probably have the best defense in the country next season. But Jim Knowles loves to go wide tech, and last year he loved to be very conservative. The year before that he loved to be super aggressive. And there just are questions more about Ohio State than Georgia. So I'm picking Georgia to win that game. I overall think that Georgia will beat Oregon. I think that could be a lopsided matchup given Georgia's superiority at quarterback. And overall, everywhere on defense, D-line, linebacker, defensive back. There's even a chance they could have the better wide receiver room and tight end room, maybe better offensive line. And they certainly have the better head coach. I have that bronze crown to signify who would be the best team who didn't participate in the national championship game, and that's Ohio State. Ohio State could totally beat Georgia. They could beat anyone on here. I think that they're going to be a very impressive team. If not for some questions about Ohio State's offensive line, and a lot of that relates actually to the Cotton Bowl against Missouri, if Ohio State just destroyed Missouri in the Cotton Bowl, looked confident and looked energized, and I have questions about Will Howard as a passer too, I'd probably pick them to win it all instead of Georgia. And I'm being totally honest when I say that. If just a few things from last season changed, and not much in the 2024 preseason. I think Ohio State won the 2024 preseason with the starters they got back and their returning production. Ohio State's a very good team. They're number 2 in my power rankings. Georgia's number 1. If you want to get the rest of that, you can check out my Patreon page and see the article that I wrote. And last but not least, I told you to stick around until the end of the video, and the video was a little longer than I expected, but last year this probably would have taken an hour for me to record because of all the teams and the matchups that I wanted to explain. So I'm getting better at making these videos not 50 minutes long. This is what a 14-team college football playoff would look like in my opinion. By that I mean with my record predictions and how I think everything would be seeded. And something that I find interesting, because this will likely be the model that the College Football Playoff Committee adopts from the 2026 through 2027 season moving forward, is I don't have Oregon advancing as far. In fact, I have Alabama instead advancing far. And you get Michigan versus Ohio State for the third time. Same with Georgia versus Alabama for the third time, which would be very intriguing. Ohio State and Georgia match up for the national championship game. They play in what would be a better game, I think, than Georgia versus Oregon. But I still have Georgia just winning out because I think they have less questions than Ohio State does. But what's interesting here is in these expanded playoffs, I think once you get past 8 teams, 10 teams, 12 teams, when you start expanding the playoff, and I found this when I did a 16-team model, which LSU and Ole Miss are added to the 14-team model, Iowa and Kansas State, in my opinion, are added to the 16-team model. The likelihood of upsets, I think, would actually decrease past, that 8, 10, 12-team expansion mark. Because past the top 10 or top 12 teams, there's a big drop-off, typically. Like team number 6 and team number 10 are typically very similar. You see this in FPI and different power rankings. And team number 16 is, in power rankings, is actually very similar to team number 10 as well. But we're not talking about power rankings. We're talking about seeding. Seeding is different. Seeding is more deserving rather than potential. And potential is what matters a lot in the playoff. Like, deserving and strength of record matters to get in the playoff. Throw that stuff out the window the minute you get in the playoff. It's all about potential, because teams will typically bring their best performance possible to the college football playoff. They will. And at that point, look, Ole Miss at number 13. I think Ole Miss is a much inferior team, for example, compared to Oregon, despite the fact that by seeding they aren't very different. Because I think that Ole Miss is an easier strength of schedule, but they both go 10-2, and both Ole Miss and Oregon have similar quality best wins, so they'll be seeded similar. Ole Miss is not beating Alabama at home. At least I don't think they will. Oregon, much better shot, but since they're against Utah and then Ohio State, they run into a roadblock pretty early. So that Cinderella story ends after the first round. Georgia and Michigan, the SEC and Big Ten champions in the 14-team model that's rumored, will get byes. Only the SEC and Big Ten champion will, not the four highest conference champions will get byes. So yeah, I also have LSU jumping in. So LSU and Ole Miss are the first 2 teams out. The first 4 out, if we were to use a March Madness term, would be LSU, Ole Miss, Iowa, and Kansas State, in that order. Outside of Oregon not reaching the national championship game, and also Alabama consequentially in part going further, the result's pretty similar. Georgia, I still think, would win the national championship. Michigan, Ohio State, and Georgia still reach the Final Four. And if not for Oregon upsetting Alabama, I would have picked Alabama to reach the Final Four. So there's not much of a difference. There's just a few more games, less bye weeks, and a greater chance for an extra ACC or Big 12 team to get in. But that's all I have to say in this video. It was long, I know. Hopefully I helped you better understand the 12-team playoff, and hopefully you found my predictions to be interesting and intriguing. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, comment down below, and check out my Patreon page, merchandise store, and sign up for my March Madness bracket if you haven't already. Thanks to Crash2488 for being a Heisman member, to Spencer Bringhurst, Chris Lane, and SFS and Nerder for being All-American members, and to Will Loftus, John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for being All-Conference members. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you all around. If you're listening on Spotify, check out my YouTube page via the channel description, and make sure to follow the channel. Bye-bye.